The Chinese Communist Party celebrated its 100th anniversary last week, with President Xi Jinping declaring that the success of China rests on the ruling regime and that China will not be oppressed by foreign powers. While the CCP has shown incredible flexibility in terms of social, economic and global changes over the past 100 years, much of the Western world has been disappointed that the country has not become a more liberal and democratic country as it became richer and more integrated into the global economy. With the country now in direct competition with the United States and President Xi Jinping largely expected to be the face and the future of the CCP, what does this all mean for China's foreign policy? We connect with J. James Kim, Senior Research Fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and we also connect with Wen-Ti Sung, Academic Fellow at the Australian Centre on China in the World at Australian National University. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us. And, well, Dr. Kim, I understand you're in Washington right now, and, well, you were observing the CCP anniversary from there, and last week, it was a celebration, of course, of the CCP's rule in China as well for 72 years. And President Xi made a public statement where he declared that the goal of creating a moderately prosperous society in China is now complete. What was your impression of the 100-year celebration, and what significance does it have within the context of US-China relations?
Hi, Soo-young. It's so nice to be joining you again and to talk about this historic moment that China has sort of rung in. And watching some pieces and parts of the celebration, and also listening to President Xi's statement, and later, mulling over the words and in the transcript, I sensed this tone of confidence, and it's quite similar to other public statements that President Xi has made in the past. The focus was squarely on the party and China as a nation and people. I think the intended audience was mostly domestic, and one way to get a sense of this is to contrast this statement with his January speech at the World Economic Forum, where he focused on other issues like inclusive growth and peaceful coexistence. These issues were not really that emphasized in this statement. But if you compare that speech with this one, there's also some certain common theme. And one common theme that I sensed was this theme of defiance against what she called, quote, arrogance, prejudice, and hatred of forcing one's own history, culture, and social system upon others. This was a statement that he made during the Davos Forum. In this speech, he was equally defiant by vowing to not accept sanctimonious preaching from other nations. It was clear that President Xi was mindful of the differences of opinion from within China by making an appeal to peace, democratic principle, and mutual respect. But if we look at that statement about other countries infringing on China's internal affairs, and within the broader context of U.S.-China relations, I think it was a very strong statement that he wanted to make to the audience, both within and outside, that China was not going to be taking any of it. You could argue that there's an element of contradiction in that statement, given how China has treated other countries, even though it says that China, said that China would respect the internal affairs and sovereignty of other countries. You could look at some of the dealings that China has had with other countries like India. South Korea has experienced its share with that incidents. Japan and Australia currently undergoing it, but nonetheless, it's very clear that he felt very confident, and he was ringing in another 100 years of Chinese rule, and with greater optimism.
So definitely confident, assertive, and even offensive with some of his statements. And well, Professor Sung, it seems quite clear that most advanced economies and democracies are now highly wary of China's authoritarianism at home and its assertiveness in the world. What do you think Xi Jinping's foreign policy is? Do you think he's going to actively try and improve relations with Western countries amid all this criticism? Or do you think he's going to lean towards bolstering ties with the likes of Iran and Russia?
I think it's going to be a difficult balancing act, of course. And I think Xi Jinping is trying to brand China as a largely pro-status quo power. It's saying that it doesn't really want to revolutionize the international order, but it does want to renegotiate and reinterpret China's place within it. So a lot of times Xi Jinping's concern is still primarily domestic in nature. It's about ensuring the survival of the Chinese Communist Party as a rare party state. Now, precisely because it is a relatively rare, different kind of system of government, so China will always focus on gaining acceptance from existing great power in the system. Most of them are Western powers, even as it tries to hedge by insulating itself from Western cultural influence. So as part of that strategy, China would try to do both diplomatic and institutional maneuvers. China will, like you said, try to improve relations with countries like Russia and Iran, for example. But these are ultimately secondary to relationship with the West. And with these countries, while they're both authoritarian in one way or the other, China does share relatively little ideological affinity with these actors, although they are still a nice bargaining chip to have on China's side as they negotiate with the West. So I think in addition to that, China will be pursuing institutional influences. It's trying to get more leadership position in international institutions like the UN, for example. It's also trying to internationalize the RMB, try to make it an international reserve currency. When it does it, when it accomplishes it, the RMB and the Chinese economy may be, in a way, too big to fail for the rest of the world. And by extension, that also makes the CCP polity survival too important for others to challenge. So it's in that sense that China is trying to be both pro-status quo, but also trying to renegotiate the terms of engagement on China's terms.
And definitely it's been emphasizing that it's going to do certain things on its own terms. And well, Dr. Kim, under Xi Jinping, do you think that US-China relations could improve significantly if their leaders meet in October? Or do you think there are going to be some limits to their cooperation? And if they do meet, what do you expect them to prioritize?
So based on this speech and also on some of the stated intentions that Professor Sung has mentioned in his previous answer, I don't think there's any indication of change in China's approach to great power relations. Unless we see some changes in the Biden administration's overall approach to China, I don't think there's much hope for improved relations here. So overall, it's going to be competitive, but there is a possibility of momentary truce or localized cooperation on specific areas of mutual interest. So tactical cooperation on issues like climate change, for instance. This is one area where there might be significant cooperation because both countries' interests in many ways overlap. Another area where the two countries might cooperate is on the issue of North Korean denuclearization. Where the two countries have in the past shown some appetite for cooperation. So in those kinds of specific areas that they could cut out some possibility of localized cooperation, you might see, some warming or engagement, so to speak. But in other areas, overall, it's going to be a competitive enterprise.
And well, when it comes to Taiwan, Professor Sung, now she issued some warnings about pursuing Taiwanese independence, promising to smash efforts in pursuit of Taiwanese independence. How hard do you think the US is going to push China, and how far do you think China will go to protect its claims over Taiwan?
I think U.S. will push high enough to give the Taiwanese society confidence in its continued survival and security. It will also push high enough to make sure that other American allies and partners, including the likes of Japan, South Korea, and Australia, to give them confidence that U.S. will remain a champion for liberal democracies. But at the same time, it won't push so hard as to significantly raise the risk of military escalation across the Taiwan Strait. So you'll be doing piecemeal things like, for example, selling Taiwan more defensive weaponries. You will find ways for Taiwan to participate as observer in international institutions and other multilateral security forums, so as to leverage more resources for other countries to also chip in on Taiwan's international presence. And I mean, if you zoom out, it almost goes without saying that no one really has appetite for conflict. It's definitely not Taiwan, not the US, nor China. And for China, they much prefer to not risk fighting a war that you cannot win. And to follow Sun Tzu, China's approach is to win without fighting. And you much prefer to use peaceful means of united front warfare, economic interest, to gradually build a constituency in Taiwan, that will be more open to unification with China. And it's for that reason that China so far hasn't really set a firm deadline on unification with Taiwan. Again, as a way to leave that flexibility and also to use potential but flexible threat to Taiwan as a bargaining chip.
Well, while it's in nobody's interest to really have conflict, Dr. Kim, recent satellite images by the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies show that more than 100 new silos for intercontinental ballistic missiles are being constructed in the desert near the northwestern city of Yumen in China. And given the concerns right now over China's increased defense spending and also signs that they're modernizing their nuclear deterrent, what does this mean for the United States? Do you see the possibility of another arms race happening?
Well, China has continually increased its defense spending. And President Xi has stated that China needs to have a strong military by accelerating the modernization of its force capability. So it's not at all surprising that China is building new silos. U.S. in recent years has also substantially increased its defense spending with an eye towards the Indo-Pacific. And I presume that it will continue to do so, since the consensus in Washington is that it sees a force imbalance in the Indo-Pacific that favors China. And I'm very happy to hear Professor Sung argue that actually, his assessment that China is not interested in any kind of military confrontation in Taiwan Strait. And I think the U.S. would like to do that. But what the U.S. seems to see right now, at least some of the assessments coming out in the U.S., in Washington, is that the situation favors China more so than the United States. And so the U.S. is playing catch up. And you can tell by looking at some of the confirmed recent statements from Admiral Davidson and Admiral Aquilino that the U.S. needs to do this in more earnest. So I presume that the U.S. defense spending will continue to increase. Focus will be in the Pacific region, and I don't think China is going to back down here. So yes, the long-winded answer, the long way of answering your question is we're likely to see an arms race.
And well, it's not just in terms of the military or defense spending that these two powers are competing, but in other areas such as the economy, tech, infrastructure. Professor Song, it seems like China has been painting itself as sort of the defender of the developing world, bargaining as the G77 plus China at the United Nations, for instance, and rolling out infrastructural projects under the Belt and Road Initiative, and now supplying COVID-19 vaccines in countries across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. How strong do you think their narrative is against the United States' efforts to build back democracies in the world? Do you think the US can really expect ideology to really win over practicality?
Well, the efficacy of that narrative, China is the great international benefactor and champion of the developing world. I think it's decidedly mixed so far. It almost goes without saying again that concrete material interests so far often dominate over ideology and discourse. So in China's immediate neighborhood in Southeast Asia, for example, it's been a major recipient of China's vaccine donations. It's also been a major recipient of China's BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, all these infrastructure assistance programs. So presumably, if everything goes well, then over time they will harmonize that region's technological standards, other kind of economic protocols, infrastructure programs, so that maybe at some point economic dependency will translate into political affinity with China and become kind of like a China potential sphere of influence. But yet that's the theory. And if we hear one thing out of Southeast Asia, it's that they don't want to choose sides between the US and China. BRI is nice, but strategic alignment is something else. And we hear the same thing out of Pacific Island countries as well. So far, transactional approach still dominate in that relationship between US, China, and other smaller countries' strategy within it.
Well, I'm afraid this is all we have time for today, but that was J. James Kim, Senior Research Fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, and Wen Ti-sung, Academic Fellow at the Australian Centre on China in the World at Australian National University. Thank you both so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you very much for watching.